Hello everyone, welcome to the Lake Rejuvenation and Management course. This is a collaborative initiative by Bangalore University, Friends of Lakes, Biome, and A-Tree. The purpose of this course is to educate citizens on lake rejuvenation, covering both engineering and environmental aspects. Happy learning.
So our first speaker for the day is Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni, and this is his bio.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks to Atri and thanks especially to Biome, Shubha Ramchandran from Biome, who got me to do this talk. So let's begin. Effectively, what I'm trying to say is, most people talk about groundwater. And when it comes to groundwater, it's usually about a well or a bore well. So it really sort of begins and finishes at a well. But there's more to groundwater than a well. And if one can actually look at groundwater through the lens of what aquifers are, then I think one begins to perceive what is there in this subject beyond the subject of wells. So on that note, a short introduction to the organization that I work for. Aquidam, Advanced Center for Water Resources Development and Management. We are, I don't know what we are really. We are both a think tank, but we also do a lot of implementation work on the ground. But primarily, we are a science-based organization. We work on the science of groundwater, and we work in one of the most geologically, hydrogeologically diverse settings in the world. Our entire work is based on partnership and collaboration. So this is like an aquifer typology map of India, a map that we've developed over a period of about 20-25 years. And the black dots represent the locations where we worked. And of course, many of the dots are locations with clusters of 5, 10, 15, even 20 villages. Our goal is to bring communities as close to their aquifers as possible, and therefore we also need to explain what aquifers are, which I'll try and do in this session. So, our pursuit of improved groundwater management is based on the science of aquifers. We do a lot of training, capacity building. We also teach in some mainstream educational institutes in India. Our work on the ground is through the concept of action research and leading to decision support to communities. And because of a lot of our work in the first three bullets, we tend to get pulled into policies and programs. So with that brief introduction, let me jump into the subject matter straight away. I want to begin with a set of slides, a quick sort of deck of slides, where I'll talk about the importance of groundwater. I mean, it's a well-known fact today that more than half the world's population is dependent on groundwater. We have, so pictures from across the world, from India, from the very tribal interiors of Shivpuri district of Madhya Pradesh to the central highlands in Vietnam, which saw in the sort of 60s, 70s, this was the place not to be. A lot of dependence in the central highlands of Vietnam is on groundwater. And the setting is very similar to where I live in Western Maharashtra. So the geological, hydrogeological setting is very similar. So we also draw upon a lot of the similarities while highlighting the differences when we look at our own work on groundwater. Western countries, Montpellier in France, still receiving a part of its water supply from and sort of a very ancient system derived from spring water. This is Marathwada and this is Tumkur in the state of Karnataka. So this entire dependency on groundwater across the globe, across the world, means that every year at a global scale, 1,000 cubic kilometers or 1,000 billion cubic meters of groundwater is extracted, across the globe. Of course, it's not uniform. As you can see, Asia alone extracts about 65% of the annual extraction. So on the continent of Asia, you see a lot of that extraction. Again, 50% of this total annual extraction is meant for irrigation or agricultural water on the continent of Asia alone. The green represents domestic and the orange represents industrial. Oh, of course, this has been taken from secondary sources, somewhat outdated, 2013. I'm sure this has changed, but it gives us a very good canvas of, coming up with this whole, figures in terms of, I would, for example, say this is perhaps the most extracted material from inside the earth. Groundwater is. And therefore, if we sort of step back and look at the history of groundwater across the world, the history of wells across the world goes back to about 11,000 years. And this is based on archaeological evidence and dating and so on and so forth. But in India, it goes back at least 3,000 to 4,000 years, the sort of history of wells. So you actually have evidence that today's civilization has also a lot to do with groundwater usage over the last 5, 6, 7 centuries. Now, I think, again, taking another step back, if you look at the legacy of groundwater usage until the 19th century, there was something unique about that history. Let's take a history of 15,000 years before present, which was the start of agriculture, which was the start of settled human living across the globe. Then you can imagine, I'm just going to show you 2 pictures and then show you the text on the slide. So this is a very old spring in Uttarakhand, a community spring. And even today, we see mechanisms. This is the below the headworks into the well section, a Persian wheel or a rehet or a moat, as it was called in my part of the country. And you see, you still see vestiges of this almost 2, 3, 4 centuries old tradition of wells and springs in many landscapes. And just to cull out a summary out of this work, till the 19th century, access to groundwater was widespread, but it was from shallow sources, shared or community sources, usually from hand-dug wells, springs, and in the sort of western part of Asia and part of the Middle East, called kanats and karezes and different names. What today in engineering sciences or hydrology are called infiltration galleries. Extraction was not mechanical in that sense, not driven by external fuel or power, but driven by animal traction, human traction, use of pulleys, gears. So the rehets and moats are an evidence of that. So there was a peculiar manner of extraction. There was a peculiar manner of accessing groundwater. And this legacy, it happened over a long period of time. Now, let's jump to the modern period. Let's jump to the last 60 to 70 years. And this is part of a larger documentary that we had made about our work, about the groundwater story in India. So I'm going to very quickly show you this, a snippet from this larger documentary, which will give you a summary of the last 70 years of groundwater, of the groundwater story in India. Many people have written about it. We ourselves talk about it, but it might be useful for all of us to go through it once more.
India's groundwater story is quite unique. India extracts almost a quarter of the global extraction of groundwater. And what makes this story unique is the fact that India was not such a groundwater dependent country even at the time of independence. When India became independent, our vision of water management was about dams and constructing dams and canals in order to take water to people. But I believe that didn't happen for various reasons. And therefore, the last mile connectivity, the last mile delivery of water wasn't achieved for many years. So the gap was actually filled by groundwater. Subsequently, in the 1950s and 60s, as the push for green revolution in terms of achieving food security increased, technology kicked in. And in the hard rock areas of India, for example, the borewell technology came. Droughts were also a factor or a stimulus for technology. For instance, the 1971-72 drought in Maharashtra and in large parts of western and southern India prompted infusion of the hand pump for access to drinking water. And in order to actually put in a hand pump, we brought in the technology of borewell in hard rock regions of India. Technology proliferates very rapidly. And the technology that came in for drinking water sourcing in the drought-prone regions of India quickly was taken up as technology that could access water for all regions. Urban, industrial, and moreover agriculture. As we deepened our existing wells and we drilled deeper through our boreholes, our groundwater extraction really grew. Around the 1980s and subsequently even in the 1990s, with the advent of electric pumps, especially with the advent of submersible pumps, people could actually drill deeper, put in pumps at whatever depth they wanted and extract water from greater and greater depths. So in some ways, it was a race to drill deeper and a race to the pump house to almost install pumps of higher capacities and so on and so forth. So today, India is perhaps the largest user of groundwater in the world, which is a well-known fact. But we also have the largest density of wells, so roughly 30 to 40 million wells in India. And we kind of have technologies that can access water from depths of thousands of feet, making it a very, very unique proposition.
So to move ahead, you've watched the video a bit, and let's leave it there at the moment. On the other side, if you look at India's often unrecognized groundwater dependencies, more than 90% of rural drinking water supplies come from groundwater. 70% of the water in agriculture is groundwater. Almost half of our urban and industrial supplies are groundwater based. So much so that in fairly recent times, we have also seen a lot of wells coming up in forest areas for wildlife, for tigers. We ourselves have seen it in the central Indian sort of forest regions. We've seen it in Melghat. We've seen it in parts of the Corbett National Park. And, coming back to these numbers, if we combine these numbers and we work out a sort of demographic element out of that, we extract a demographic element out of that, You can say that 1 billion Indians use groundwater every day in some way or the other in our country. And that's a huge, huge water footprint. Now, if we look at these these two slides, then we begin to wonder, how has the legacy till the 19th century changed? And the legacy has changed on both the access and extraction counts. Access, and I could have actually presented data, but due to want of time, I haven't. But I can actually show you data on the basis of which I'm making these two inferences, drawing these two inferences. Access became individualized, so there were fewer and fewer community wells, and it also therefore got privatized in more ways than one. My well, my water, whatever's underneath my land is my water. And it happened through, as the film showed, deepening of dug wells, drilling of bore wells in parts of Karnataka, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, and Maharashtra. There was a phase in which we had something called duck cum bore wells, where bore wells were drilled at the base of dug wells, and so on. So shallow levels, intermediate levels, deep levels, we have tapped all the possible sort of depths from which we can extract groundwater. And extraction, again, as the film showed, transition from animal or human power to mechanical devices like the diesel pumps initially, then the electric pumps, and then, of course, the submersible pumps. So high-end pumps capable of extracting large volumes of water over short periods of time. So that's another dimension where we began to extract lots of water within shorter time frames. And it's important to remember this. So the whole legacy changed after the 19th century, and the last 60, 70 years have woken us up to the fact that we have a very checkered combination of dependency on groundwater. Here, for example, the irrigation dependency and the extent of exploitation. I'm not going to explain these maps too much, but on the other hand, if we look at climate and especially rainfall and what's happened to precipitation over the last 114 years, 115 years, 120 years, then we see certain trends. We see certain trends in certain districts. So this is just to make the correlation and bring out a paradox of sorts where regions of lesser groundwater dependencies and lesser extraction. So there are regions of higher groundwater dependencies, higher extraction. So the lesser groundwater extraction regions have actually seen a decline in rainfall. So we are posed with a dilemma on questions like, should we move the next green revolution to where we have extracted less? But we have another problem, and that's the climate and the rainfall problem. If we then, as a second level, combine depletion, areas of depletion or areas of overexploitation and areas of contamination. So this is the CGWB's data from 2017. And if we combine it with their own data sets on arsenic, fluoride, iron, salinity, and nitrate, we can at a very, very gross level, we can say that 60 to 70% of the districts in India have become vulnerable to either a depletion problem or a contamination problem. And now, therefore, if we come out with this 2 or 3 sets of major problems we are facing on groundwater, one is, of course, depletion, falling water levels, wells going dry, some traditional systems of water or heritage structures of water, like the Nimrana well in Rajasthan, completely gone. So along with the decline in water levels, that whole legacy till the 19th century is lost on many, many fronts. Water quality has serious implications on human health. And if we say we are so dependent on groundwater, any changes to water quality, any contamination is certainly going to affect human health. So fluorosis, arsenicosis, high salinity, and a lot of distress. In the mountains, the springs that springs that form the lifeline of mountain water supplies are running dry. And there are various reasons, but it's a part of the whole problem. And last but not least, so again, in the Himalayan region, for example, our work in the Himalayan region has indicated that at least 60% of springs have depleted, have declined in terms of the discharge they deliver. Last but not least, groundwater depletion has led to the drying up of a variety of water bodies, rivers, for example, lakes in different areas, even small ponds. And we'll try and understand this as we go along. So how do you deal with this problem? And one of the reasons why we've not been able to deal with these problems for some years at least is that how do we recognize the resource of groundwater? Do we recognize it as a part of the water cycle? Do we recognize it as a part of a river basin? Do we recognize it as a part of a watershed? Where is the identity for groundwater? Because unless and until you take the identity of groundwater beyond a well or a borehole or a tube well, the whole argument remains incomplete. How do you define the resource of groundwater? And that's the reason why you need a context. And the context...
Surface water is essentially flow. We construct reservoirs, dams, artificial lakes to convert that flow into stocks. Once water percolates in or infiltrates into the ground and becomes groundwater, it gets stored in openings or spaces within rocks and material derived from rocks. Once water enters the matrix of rocks or the open matrix of rocks, it slows down and it essentially becomes more of stock than flows. Groundwater also flows, but it depends on the properties of rocks.
So, like the little video explained, it's really the rocks inside the ground that constitute aquifers. They also must have properties that allow water largely to be stored in the openings in rocks. And these openings must be sufficiently interconnected for groundwater to flow from one point to the other across the stock of groundwater, and therefore deliver that water to wells and springs. So for example, this is a spring in a rock high up in the Himalayan mountains. And it gives, on an average, about 50 liters per minute. And therefore, for a spring like this to constantly give you 50 liters per minute over 365 days, just the discharge, just the amount of water coming out of the spring in 1 year is in excess of 25,000 cubic meters. Now, in order to deliver 25,000 cubic meters, this spring must be connected to a much larger store of groundwater, which is called the aquifer. So in more ways than one, this is a very, very simplistic definition of groundwater. The more formal definition is given here, and I'll quickly run the video. So now we actually have a definite definition or a description of groundwater, which is about rocks that are saturated, sufficiently saturated with water. Therefore, they can store water, they can transmit water reasonably enough so that water is available to sources of water supplies like springs and wells. And taking this definition forward, if we begin to think through what's happening to our aquifers, then aquifer depletion or groundwater depletion and contamination has many, many, many more dimensions than we ever imagined. The first and foremost is what's the balance between recharge and extraction. So as an aquifer gets depleted, the balance between recharge and extraction gets disturbed. But my point of argument is, if you look at B and G, they show you the same magnitude of arrows. The arrows are of the same size. And you may, therefore, if you only look at recharge and extraction, you will sort of be misguided. And you might think that an area under B and an area under G have possibly the same groundwater endowments. But when you look at the stocks, you find that the stock has depleted. So it's unlike the filling and emptying of a vessel. This stock is extremely important, and that is the reason why understanding aquifers becomes important. But when an aquifer depletes, consider for a moment that this is a single aquifer with a history of depletion. The history of depletion is not just about how much water is available and how water availability went down, how the amount of extraction went down. It's also about how it has impacted the water-related economy on one side, say agricultural productivity, agricultural incomes. How, for example, energy, if 1 unit of energy was required to pump out 1 unit of water in situation A, then it's very likely that there's still some water at the base of these two systems. Then 1 unit of water would probably need 10 units of energy. The same unit of water would require 10 units of energy to pump out. So it has the energy dimension. The drinking water security in an area would drop as a consequence of aquifer depletion. The groundwater quality would also drop as the stocks in the aquifer get depleted. And last but not least, aquifers also provide another important service, and that service is in the form of base flows, or aquifers letting out their water through rivers, lakes, streams, and even small brooks on the land surface. So in some ways, aquifers provide a certain ecosystem services to ecosystems like rivers and lakes. And this is also something we need to remember. So an aquifer is actually an entity in many dimensions: social, hydrological, engineering, environmental, economic, and from the energy angle. And that's one reason why working out sustainable, equitable, and efficient solutions, it's time for us to wake up and think through the aquifer lens. Aquifer not necessarily as a hypothetical scientific entity, but aquifer as a transdisciplinary entity which allow us to articulate sustainable, equitable, and efficient management of groundwater. Okay. Just to summarize that, aquifers are the real resource of groundwater that is part of the larger water systems. Aquifers are the correct hydrological unit for understanding and managing groundwater, because when we talk of large surface water systems, we talk of river basins. When we talk of smaller units, we talk of watersheds. Why not aquifers when we talk of groundwater? Aquifers represent a typical common pool resource. And you can understand the science of groundwater much better through the science of aquifers, bring in a more multidisciplinary, process to bear upon the process of groundwater management. You can also demystify knowledge and information through this lens. Why do we need to do all this? Because today, in a country like India, we need democratization of knowledge outcomes in order for communities collectively to take certain decisions that will lead to robust collective action. Now, having said that, and aquifers in India, and I come back to that map I showed you in my second slide, that if we begin to look at India's geological diversity, and therefore it's, in the connect to aquifers, it's aquifer diversity. That's how we can represent this map. It's a very, very generic map, but it helps us do a whole bunch of things. For example, if we take the 5,700 urban habitations in India, we can actually divide them aquifer type wise. So if you look at the alluvial systems in the Indo-Gangetic plains of India, they house about 3,000 plus towns and cities. If you look at the peninsular and eastern India with the pink, it's almost 2,000 urban habitations. If you look at the mountains, especially as the Himalayan systems, there are about 465 small and large towns in these systems. So, for instance, and I'm using this only as an example, if we were to come up with an urban groundwater management strategy, then we would need to look at or design strategies or design a strategy which is aquifer based to begin with. Because a town or a city that is tapping into groundwater, into aquifers in Karnataka, for example, and a town or a city that's tapping into aquifers in Uttar Pradesh is going to be very different. The aquifers are going to be different, so are the people. So the entire transdisciplinary process that I'm talking about will have to be designed on the basis of the strategic meaning of aquifers. Okay. Wells, for example, you like I said, if there's one thing India could be proud of, I believe India is a dug well civilization. I don't think any other country in the world has as many dug wells or has had as many dug wells as India has had. So again, for me, dug wells are very, very common across this typology. You find dug wells almost everywhere, maybe lesser in the mountains, but in all the other regions, you find dug wells. Boreholes in the hard rock regions of India and tube wells in the alluvial regions of India. So there is, even if you look at a classical infrastructure context to India's aquifer systems, then you have a horses for courses legacy from many, many years, also in the modern period. Now, with that argument, I want to now pose 2 or 3 other very important arguments. If we actually look at the definition of the environment, and I often think I'm still a sort of school student, and that's how I think through this process. So the environment is made up of spheres. We all know this. Now, each sphere for me is actually an ecosystem. And classically, the way ecosystems are defined is a little more generic. Now, one of the reasons why each of these spheres is an ecosystem is the behavior of water vis-a-vis that ecosystem. So you almost see the environment and the water cycle integrated into each other. So when I look at a diagram in environmental sciences, like this diagram, I see an embedding of the water cycle in this diagram. And without recognizing, acknowledging, and understanding that water cycle in the ecosystem context of the environment, it's difficult to make draw any inferences, especially vis-a-vis the problem that I laid out for you. Similarly, in the hydrological cycle itself, I actually see the embedding of different environments and ecosystems. Now, one of the big gaps in a lot of the arguments made on the water cycle front is usually the argument for groundwater begins and ends with infiltration, water that goes into the ground, and a little bit with exfiltration. When we actually look at this system in a little more detail, what we find is this itself is a smaller sub-cycle of the larger water cycle. And it's not a one-way cycle. It's not as if, most people tend to believe that it's only the recharge part which is important in an aquifer understanding. An aquifer is nothing but an interim storage of water that allows water to come in, called recharge, and that also discharges groundwater onto the surface, which is called discharge. But I think this needs to be understood in each of the aquifer typologies and in specific contexts, rural, urban, ecosystems, and many, many more things. Now, I'm going to show you a very quick set of examples real examples from the field now. So this first example is about the dynamics or the dynamic nature of groundwater. 3 villages from eastern India, part of Jharkhand, 1 village I think in West Bengal, the western part of West Bengal. This is from Jharkhand. And we developed a demand or a usage-based groundwater balance. The reference here was 2014-15. And from this balance, for example, we can clearly draw an inference that, and this is all groundwater irrigated, that this particular village is significantly irrigated by groundwater. Now, the proportion of groundwater in agriculture, 60.5% usage, is significantly high. Now, what also happened in the same village, when we started looking at a comparison between the total aquifer storage, which is the first bar, recharge, which is the second bar, and discharge from groundwater, both pumping and natural, that's the third bar. And when we took these numbers and when we used the CGWB's national level assessment of groundwater, we found that across 4 years, the assessment was different. The first year showed that the aquifer was overexploited. The second year, again overexploited. The third year, semi-critical, and the fourth year, semi-critical or something. So, it's very, very dynamic in that sense. I'm not going to spend too much time on the other 2 examples. The other 2 examples were different because in the second village called Churinsharo, it was marginally irrigated. You can see that there's very little water used in agriculture. A lot of it is evapotranspiration and base flows, so marginally irrigated. Even in this village, when we looked at the discharge versus the recharge scenario, we found that the estimates were very, very different. So again, very, very dynamic. In the third village, this was entirely rain-fed. There's hardly any water, exogenous water used in agriculture, and it looks very different. And yet, it shows a certainly different kind of dynamics on groundwater. Of course, one must remember that in each of these villages, the total aquifer storage, because they are in 3 different aquifer settings, is very different. So in the first, I think in this village, roughly 500 millimeters equivalent. In here, it's only 250, half of that. And in the first village, it's actually a little more than 500. So these are the kind of numbers, or this is also the kind of quantitative assessments that you can make. Now, again, coming back to understanding this lithodiversity or hydrogeological diversity across India's large landscape, it's important. And I'll briefly tell you through 2 examples. So here, for example, in Pune, we are doing some work on aquifer mapping and aquifers and understanding urban aquifers, managing urban groundwater, and so on and so forth. So I've just taken a picture of one lake. And since this is about lakes, I thought I'll just end with these 2 examples. So Katraj Lake in Pune, and this is a short history from 1985 till 2020. And you see changes. I mean, over this almost 40-year period, you see a big change. I mean, one big change you see is the neighborhood of the lake was fairly barren. It was all agriculture in 1985. It's an old Landsat imagery. Then in 2004, you can actually see a green area developing around the lake. Develops, and today it's fairly green. So the lake itself, the immediate neighborhood of the lake has actually turned greener. And there was an effort to do that. Trees were planted, forest was cultivated. There are actually two lakes. There's an upper lake and a lower lake. But if you actually look at the water and the quality of water, especially in these last three images, then despite the greening of the neighborhood, the quality of water, especially the growth of, you know, unwanted vegetation, for example. Also, because of the urbanization around the lake, you can see how it's gone up. The release of certain kind of wastewater effluents into the lake has actually led to a certain deterioration in the quality of that lake water. The other thing, and this is again something that we are just discovering right now, is a lot of the earlier inflow to the lake has reduced. Not so much because of the catchment, of course the catchment has been affected, but the wells, a lot of wells came up as a part of the urbanization and they started pumping. So the natural base flow contribution to a system like this or even like this has gone down. We are still in the progress of studying this, but I thought I'd just flag that as an important element. Then I'll talk a little bit about Sarjapura, and this is where we worked with Biome some years back. And like sort of lot of people talk about, okay, what is the role of a lake in terms of groundwater? And the popular notion is, okay, if you have a lake, then it keeps recharging the groundwater in the surrounding areas. Now, there is no one-way traffic in nature. Nature is always a two-way traffic. Nature always claps with two hands. Now, even in Sarjapura, what we discovered, and of course, these are the changes that you see, but I think more important was when we looked at the relationship between the Kaikondrahalli lake and the adjoining wells, and a lot of people contributed to that whole study. It was a fully participatory study. I may come to this. I'll just show you the results from that. Yeah, from that. So what we found was in the pre-monsoon period, there were phases in which the water levels in the lake, especially when the wells were not pumped, the groundwater levels in the aquifers stood slightly above the stage of the lake. And in that period, groundwater tended to flow into the lake. So especially when the lake was, when the water levels in the lake dropped, when the inflow into the lake stopped and the water levels dropped into the lake, especially when dug wells were not pumped, there were phases in which water was going into them. But when the dug wells remained pumped and when the water levels in the aquifers dropped below the level in the lake started sort of giving to groundwater, discharging to groundwater. This was in the pre-monsoon period. In the post-monsoon period, for a larger period of time, when there was sufficient inflow into the lakes, most of the times pumping was somewhat reduced, but most of the times the lake was actually contributing to this whole system. I'm just going to end with a simple sort of concept on this lake groundwater interface. And the lake groundwater interface also requires a lot of studies. And it's again going to be perhaps one of the next sort of research ideas for the next few years. So I was looking at a system in Pune, which I studied for almost, an aquifer I studied for almost 15 years. And I actually saw this story that I told you in the video. I saw this story unfolding before my eyes as a student. In the year 1983, the water levels in this particular well were at ground level. The well used to overflow for a few days during the monsoon. The summer water levels were only about 3 to 4 meters below ground level. And that's the thickness, the total thickness of the aquifer. And as the water levels dropped, there was a stream about 100 meters from the well, and I could almost see this change. So this is the bed level of the stream. In the earlier years, the stream used to run dry possibly for 1 or 2 months. There was water in the stream for 10 to 11 months. As groundwater levels in the aquifer dropped, you can see that the water levels, for example, in 86, there was hardly maybe 3-4 months beyond the monsoon when the stream was flowing. So much so that in 1989 onwards, 89, 90 onwards, the stream did not show any base flow at all. Because even after recharge to the aquifer, the monsoon levels remained in the well, in the adjoining aquifers, remained below the bed level of the stream. So it's important for us to understand that the lake or the stream and groundwater interface is also going to depend on the status of groundwater stocks in the aquifer. In the case of A, for example, what I got, and I've just animated it a bit, this is the monsoon water level in the well and in the adjoining water body, which is a stream. It could also be a lake. It dropped in summer and the stream went dry. There was a 2-meter drop over here. The stream went dry. There may have been some trickles here. In B, this was the pre-depletion monsoon level. It dropped and it went a little beyond the base. There was a 3-meter drop in level. There was absolutely no flow for 2-3 months of the year. And in the case of C, the post-depletion level itself was further down. Maybe there was some flow during the monsoon. I remember actually having measured this, that after the last rain, there was flow in the stream only 10 to 12 days after the last rains. I remember having told someone that the last rain was on the day of Dasera. I think this was 92 or something. And the stream ran dry about 15 days later. So 15 days before Diwali, the stream ran dry. So effectively, this is what happened. I'll actually end on that note. I could have actually shown you a few more things, but I don't want to go ahead. So I think the context of aquifers is not just limited to the management of groundwater, who should use how much should agriculture use, what is the cropping pattern we should grow, so on and so forth. So that's a direct means of management. But I think we need to bring that context or bring that understanding of aquifers in other problems like urban water security or ecosystem security or the whole relationship between ecosystems and groundwater. And I refrain from showing you one of the dimensions of our work, which is spring revival. But I'll end on that note that in the city of Pune, even as we talk today, we have gone to the municipality and with the idea that we have actually identified 30 to 40 springs along the course of our 2 major rivers, the Mula and Mutha, and then it becomes the Mula Mutha. So along the entire stream course, the main stream course in Pune, the main river course in Pune, we have identified locations where groundwater naturally discharges to the river water body. And we are talking to the municipality and getting them to notify these areas so that these areas can be protected as natural groundwater discharge areas. I had a few slides on recharge, but I'm going to refrain from showing you that because recharge is something that comes to the human mind automatically as depletion happens. But we actually don't look at the discharge side. And the discharge side of groundwater, the natural discharge side of groundwater is where the concept of groundwater in and as ecosystems begin. So I'll leave you with that parting thought. Thank you.